papers that she's been a co-author on, looking at mosquitoes and connecting what we know about the different kinds of societal environments that mosquitoes like to be in, connecting Landsat imagery, looking at mosquito traps. And one of the reasons that I was interested in Shannon's in the work that Shannon's done is that there are actually very, very few articles out there where people who have done modeling have also looked at trapping data. And so I just thought this was just a wonderful opportunity. I haven't met Shannon personally, but she and I have a common colleague in New York City that we are both hoping to do work with in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. LaDeau and have her introduce herself in a little bit more detail. Thank you, Shannon, for being here today on behalf of the SEAS internship program.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about my research, and I do have a bit of a kind of convoluted path that I've taken to get to studying mosquitoes in urban areas, and I find, certainly with family, I'm often trying to explain why I'm doing that and how I got there. I actually started my PhD training as a forest ecologist and did my PhD thesis at Duke University looking at changes in forest health and forest composition and life cycles under climate change, under different CO2 atmospheres and climate change scenarios. And it wasn't until I started my postdoc at the National Zoo in DC that I started working with non-vegetation organisms. So at that point, looking at West Nile virus impacts in birds. And during that postdoc, I was able to make that switch largely because I had a lot of training while I was at Duke in statistical analyses and different kinds of spatio-temporal model and methodologies that for ecology are really important. How do you get both space and time into a model where you can derive inference? And so the work that I did there allowed me to kind of transition into a postdoc for 3 years, again at the National Zoo at the Smithsonian in DC, looking at West Nile virus impacts in birds. And so I wasn't working with live birds, I was working with data that had been collected across the country. And a lot of what that identified was that there were these kind of more urban hotspots of where birds were really susceptible to West Nile virus. So if you look at crows across the entire nation, you find crows everywhere, but the places where they were most likely to be exposed to West Nile virus and to die were near urban areas. And so that really kind of led me down this path toward an interest in learning about the mosquitoes that carry the West Nile virus and mosquito communities and some of the ecology around those urban areas. And so today I don't work very much with birds, but I am going to talk a little bit about the mosquito work that I've done. And yeah, honestly, when I started doing it, it was not my intention to go into inner cities and talk to people. I just kind of wanted to collect mosquitoes and figure out what was there and count things so that I could make models, but about the spatial and hopefully eventually temporal scope of mosquito community ecology. And the thing is you can't go into urban areas the same way you might go into a forest and just collect data. You actually do have to interact with people, and that actually became one of the things that I really value the most is those interactions, is getting into the communities and figuring out what they thought about the ecology in their backyard, and even what they thought about mosquitoes. Right? So certain communities have very strong feelings about their exposure to mosquitoes, and it doesn't necessarily always correspond to where we found the most mosquitoes. And so kind of trying to understand those differences has actually been really interesting. And, I hope that it continues to be a big part of my work. So I'm going to jump right into the talk. I'm I'm going to talk about mosquito ecology in these complex urban riskscapes. I'm at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in the Hudson River Valley in New York, so about an hour and a half north of New York City. We're a private independent research institute. We have about 12 to 15 PhD scientists here. We're currently closer to the 12, but hiring to look for more. We each have our own lab, and we all kind of do research around ecological complexity and ecosystem health. And we don't have degree granting structures here at the Cary, so we don't have grad students and undergrads here regularly. But we are all engaged in some sort of translation. So the Institute's mission is to do science that informs better environmental and just citizenship policies. My work, I'm going to talk about mosquitoes, but I also put these two figures up here. I work also on modeling the spatio-temporal transmission of a virus that is predominant in different species and subspecies of salmon in the Pacific Northwest. So I work a lot with kind of the hatcheries and the salmon economy there, looking at the impacts of this virus. And I also do a lot of work with ticks, and that has been increasing in the last few years, my efforts working at modeling tick abundances and Lyme disease risk, specifically looking at climate change and how predictable some of the impacts climate may have on ticks might be. But again, today I'm going to talk about mosquitoes. And so I know you all have been thinking a lot about mosquitoes, or at least done some reading and thought some about mosquitoes. Of course, everyone's really familiar with the adult stage of the mosquito, this adult here, which is the stage that bites. The females bite. They need blood to reproduce. Once they have a blood meal and have produced eggs, they lay those eggs in water, either on the surface or water or on things that are going to become wet. Those eggs develop into larvae. The larvae can live for a week to months before they pupate and emerge as adults. So a lot of the life cycle is actually in this aquatic stage, which means that when we're thinking about population growth or abundance of adult mosquitoes in the biting stage when they bug us, we really have to consider what's going on at that larval in the aquatic stage. Where are the habitats? How long do those habitats last? And what are the nutrient conditions and food resources available during that phase? A lot of the things that make that adult a stronger biter and a potential vector of disease are really determined at that juvenile phase. So how long those larvae take to grow, how much food they have, how much competition they endure, whether or not there's predators there, all of those things influence how strong they will be as adults, how big they are when they emerge, how long they live, and what their fitness is, how many offspring they'll leave behind. And of course, I focus a lot in these urban areas. And I'm sure if you've all been looking at remote sensing data and Landsat and things like that, then you know that there's some pretty stark differences between rural and urban areas, and they can happen at pretty small spatial scales as you move out of a city. Here I've highlighted both shifts in habitat composition. So right from forest into urban area, we can all see that difference, and there's that kind of suburban and residential interface in between. And there are also some pretty big differences in temperature. It tends to get hotter as you move into the urban area. You get the urban heat island effect. And part of that is because it doesn't cool down as much at night. So it maintains more of the heat in all that urban infrastructure, and you don't get as big of a range, a diurnal temperature range. We also know that you get higher densities of vector species that are actually in close proximity to human hosts. So if you have mosquitoes in the forest, they're more likely to feed on a bunch of different things and not have humans always right there. As you get into more suburban and urban areas, mosquitoes that breed there have a lot of humans nearby to bite. They don't have to go that far and they don't have to look that hard. That means they might bite a human 2 times in a row. So, and the reason that's important is that if a mosquito bites a human and picks up a pathogen, something like Zika or chikungunya, and then it goes and it bites a dog or a horse or a squirrel, it's not going to pass the pathogen on. Those animals don't maintain the pathogen, and so we call that a dead end host. But if they're going to bite a human next, then they can pass the pathogen on. So the idea of biting humans and biting humans every time is really important. So the more humans you have in close proximity to where the vectors, the mosquitoes, are breeding, the more likely you have disease risk associated with the mosquito vectors. And one of the things we've also shown, and this is a project I did with a REU student, an undergraduate student a few years ago in Baltimore. We had some rural sites and we had some urban sites. And we sampled these stormwater ponds to see what was in them. And we found lots. So in the rural site, if you just look at the rural site boxes, the blue are Culex mosquito species, the red are Aedes. So there are two different genuses of mosquitoes. The green are other. They're mosquitoes that are often more often are native mosquitoes that don't actually bite humans very often. And the big clear bar in the background are predators, things that eat mosquitoes. So in stormwater ponds, or in these ponds that collect water in more rural forested areas, you get a mix of mosquito species. Their populations, which is our y-axis, are all pretty low. And you get a lot of predators, which is keeping a lot of those populations low. If you move into an urban stormwater pond, we got a ton of Aedes species, and these are most likely our human-biting species. We got a lot of Culex and more than we did in the rural areas, and we didn't get any of those others. Again, the other mosquito species, a lot of them don't ever bite humans. They compete in those larval habitats, so they keep the other species down. When they emerge as adults, they bite things like frogs. And so you lose those when you get into the urban areas, and you also lose a lot of the predators. And we've all seen this in a stormwater pond or drainage ditch. You're not likely to find a lot of frogs and fish and dragonfly larvae, things that eat mosquito larvae. And we also get changes in phenology. And so as you get more into the urban area, you see changes in when species are there and how long. This figure here shows from April to October. Again, these data are collected from Maryland. This is outside Baltimore, about 15 kilometers outside the city in a forested area. And you've got the relative abundance on the y-axis. And you see that Aedes genus, these are most often human-biting mosquitoes, kind of peak early in the season and then they go away. Culex peaks after that, and then you get a rise of these other species. Again, your things that just breed on, just bite frogs and turtles and non-humans. And if you get into the urban area and you're looking at the same types of habitat, these are still water, stormwater pools, you see the Aedes group peaks a little bit later, but once it peaks, it stays up pretty high. Whereas Culex also kind of has a depressed peak in this and peaks around the same time, but actually has two peaks, one later in August. And then the green species, it's not that they're completely absent in the more urban areas, but they kind of try and make a go of it early on and then disappear. So you get a very significant change in phenology. These are important because it determines what's around to bite humans and when is the human biting happening. And this figure would suggest that human biting kind of rises up early in the spring and continues all summer long, which we've all felt, and it does it more so in the urban area. So the urban mosquitoes, what I'm talking about, a lot of the ones that we see now are invasive. And the predominant one we see in temperate regions is Aedes albopictus. This is the tiger mosquito. It was introduced to the US via global trade, probably boats carrying tires that we imported from Asia in the 80s and 90s. And it has very rapid development. In its native range, again, this is Japan and Western China, Eastern China, it would be a species that would lay eggs in these bamboo shoots. So that's this picture here on the top right. And the eggs can persist for months to years in this dry diapause stage, which is what makes it such a great traveler. So when people started producing tires in Asia, they cleared a bunch of forests. They would make these rubber tires and then they would store them at the edge of the forest, and the mosquitoes started to lay their eggs in the tires. which then got shipped all over the world. So in the 80s and 90s, we saw the spread of Aedes albopictus via the tire trade across all continents now. And it, because it was evolved to breed in these small bamboo shoots, it breeds very, very well, rapidly, and successfully in small containers like the cup you see down here, as well as tires. It bites mammals. It does so opportunistically. So whatever's the most abundant near it, it's going to bite. It doesn't fly that far. We're talking 100 meters. And it is a competent vector for Zika and chikungunya viruses, as well as dengue. We also see Culex. That's the other genus I spoke about. And there are a couple of different Culex species that are more resident natives. They develop a little bit more slowly. So whereas albopictus can develop from egg to adult in a week, Culex take a little bit longer, a little more than 2 weeks. All of that is temperature dependent and resource dependent. They lay their eggs on water. So they don't lay their eggs on a dry surface hoping to become wet. The eggs actually have to be laid right on water, and they have to stay wet. So they don't travel via that trade route as easily. They would have to be in water the whole time. They do fly further, on the order of 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers. They tend to bite birds more frequently than mammals, but during the later season, when birds are harder to get, they will bite humans, and that's how you get transmission of things like West Nile virus. They are more likely to be found both in these kind of tire habitats, so they will breed in urban containers, but not the small cups. Again, they can't be in something that dries out too fast because they take longer, but also in drainage ditches and stormwater sewers, so slightly bigger bodies of water than albopictus. And the work we've done in Baltimore was specifically looking to investigate how mosquito infestations were associated with health risks in different types of urban landscapes where you had infrastructure abandonment and or higher. So we based a lot of this around socioeconomic status. What is the median housing value and income value of a neighborhood? What does that mean for infrastructure maintenance in the neighborhood? And then how do we understand differences in mosquito populations across those kind of fine-scale neighborhood boundaries? This was funded by National Science Foundation through their Coupled Natural Human Systems program, which means I got to work closely with some social scientists, including Don Beeler and Jacoby Wilson, who are environmental justice and social geographer experts. Rebecca Jordan, who focuses on citizen science, as well as my colleague, entomologist Paul Eisman. It's very, very infrequent that you get funding that actually really supports this kind of cross-disciplinary effort. And so I point it out because it's a big deal, and we need more funding like this and more opportunities. We work in Baltimore because it's a long-term ecological research site supported by the NSF, which means there's some infrastructure in Baltimore set up for ecological research. We had some cars there. We had a field lab. And we have some connections with the communities. It's also a city of neighborhoods that are pretty distinct and allowed for us to cover a lot of socioeconomic and cultural distance within a very short Euclidean distance. We have to travel far to see big differences. And it's this mid-Atlantic hub for trade and travel, which of course is where we expect to see novel viruses introduced. And so when you think about mosquito-borne disease and viral risk in temperate areas, there don't tend to be a lot of things that circulate regularly. They have to be introduced each year because winter tends to shut things down. So the fact that this is a hub for trade and travel makes it a likely place to see introductions. And when I'm talking about a city of neighborhoods and those stark differences, this map is the city of Baltimore. So that's in Maryland. And it is contiguous with the Chesapeake Bay, just north of DC, about 40 miles. And this shows different neighborhoods within that city, and they are color-coded from dark pink to light pink in this particular map based on life expectancy. And so within a couple of kilometers, you can be a family who has a baby with a life expectancy of 67 years, or if you live just a couple kilometers away, your baby might have a life expectancy up to 90 years, right? I mean, that's a pretty big difference for a short distance. This life expectancy kind of takes a whole bunch of other things into account and represents a whole bunch of other things about the differences in these neighborhoods and what people's living situation in these neighborhoods is like. So this figure kind of just shows how different it can be from one site to the next in a very short distance. In our work, we focused in on 5 neighborhoods, and we chose them based on their relative socioeconomic status related to the household median income being at the city median. Those are the kind of light purple down at the bottom. We have 2 neighborhoods that are at the city median, around $42,000 a year, 2 neighborhoods that are well below it, around $15,000 to $20,000 a year, and 1 neighborhood that is about $60,000, so it's above that median income. And you can see from the spatial scale, these are not that far apart. There's maybe a kilometer from the high income to one of the low income neighborhoods in this, and some of them are contiguous. We then focused in on clusters of blocks within the neighborhoods. None of them were sharing adjacency. This distance between the 2 low-income neighborhoods is actually, it's the road to nowhere. It's this big highway that never got finished. So there's a pretty big gap between those 2. And the blocks, none of them are contiguous or adjacent. They all had at least a block's length in between. And within each block, we went in and did a whole bunch of sampling. But our main focal questions were to look at how neighborhood disinvestment, that is how much the city and community groups are putting back into the neighborhood infrastructure. If they're not putting stuff back into the neighborhood infrastructure, if they're disinvesting in that neighborhood, how does that support mosquito infestation? And how does it influence the variation in human risk across these neighborhoods? And this is what some of those neighborhoods look like. So we went out and we didn't have to look too hard to find reasons why disinvestment might actually support mosquito growth. And these are all the abandonment. So the lower income neighborhoods people are moving out of them, and the homes are being left to kind of fall in on themselves. Occasionally they'll take an entire row house. These are all row homes. Occasionally they'll take an entire block down and plant something like grass and a few trees, which you can see in the upper right. They've taken several row homes down and they've planted some small trees and grass, and they mow it a couple times a year. But I mean, the level of abandonment is just pretty stark across these. In the top left, you've got 4 row homes that are abandoned, and then what you can't see is the next 2 actually are inhabited. So people are still living in these neighborhoods. If everybody moves out of an entire block, the city's more likely to go in and take down the buildings. But you can't force people to move out, and we have to have somewhere for them to go. A lot of the abandoned infrastructure is then the site of these illegal dumps. And so you can see in the bottom left, you've got a pile of tires. There were 38 tires there. That's not casual littering. This is not a neighborhood that is creating its own garbage. People are more likely to litter when they see this, but this is illegal dumping. So because there's very few people actually living here, they're more likely to attract people, even companies that pick up garbage and come in and dump it. Again, this pile of toilets, that's not the residents, that's a contractor or somebody dumping those. The other thing that happens is that the building's roofs tend to start to go, and the first thing people do is they put up these blue tarps, or sometimes they're other color, but often they're blue. And so a lot of the buildings, by the time they really break down, have had these tarps up there, and the tarps just get left behind, which are also big pools of water. So lots of things that collect water in these neighborhoods that are beyond the kinds of things we tend to think about when talking to people about what are you doing in your own backyard that might be collecting water and breeding mosquitoes. When we look at the kind of remote sensing / landscape level data across these neighborhoods, we see the lower income neighborhoods are kind of on the left of each of these figures. There's a relative scale on the y-axis, so higher than 0 is more, lower is less. And if you look at the numbers of abandoned buildings, and we can see this from aerial views, there are a lot more abandoned buildings in the lower income neighborhoods. That makes sense. that's associated with a lot more garbage in the lower income neighborhoods. Again, that makes sense, especially given what we drove around and saw. It also is associated with more vegetation. So the NDVI, the normalized differential vegetation index, I'm saying that.
Well, you did.
Thanks. The NDVI, which is how green is this block, right? It's greener in these same low-income neighborhoods. It's almost equally green in the high-income neighborhoods. So you see a kind of a U-shaped pattern where the moderate socioeconomic neighborhoods, the two down here, actually have the lowest vegetation, lowest green score. And here I'm showing some of our higher NDVI neighborhoods. So people tend to think of the urban areas being very depopulative trees and canopy cover. And in fact, Baltimore is actually pretty green. It's got a lot of green tree areas. And they, this is a higher income neighborhood on the right and a lower income neighborhood on the left. And you wouldn't be able to tell that necessarily. And they have about the same NDVI. However, if you look at where the trees are in the low income neighborhood, the blow up that I just put in has one at the very bottom, one row house with a roof, and then it's got 1, 2, 3 that don't have a roof. The trees are always behind the row homes that aren't inhabited. And that is where you see things like this pile of tires. And so the trees are very much abandoned. They're a sign of abandonment. People don't tend to like them in these neighborhoods because they're a sign of abandonment. It's where the garbage is. It's where they see the rats. It's where people associate crime occurring, again, because there's nobody that lives there. We went into, this is a model, a diagram up here in the upper right that shows what a block looks like. And every block is divided into these parcels, and we have these parcel maps for every single block. And we would go into every parcel and sample all the juvenile habitat. We would count how many water holding structures there were. We'd look at what was in those water holding containers. And we did that every year for 4 years. So we have a ton of data on this juvenile habitat, what it looks like across the neighborhoods at very fine parcel scales, as well as what happened to it over time. And in general, we find things that are container habitats that fall into the categories of discarded and unmanaged, so trash, and we've got tires in the toilets and lots of cups and other things, or functional. Functional things included rain gardens and gutters and planters. And we tend to find that there were more culex and 80s, mosquitoes, at the pupae level. So that is, they'd survived and had pupated and would come out very soon as adults. We found more of those in these discarded and unmanaged habitats than we did in functional. And we also found more of these discarded and unmanaged habitats in the areas that had greater numbers of abandoned buildings. So, this isn't groundbreaking. It makes sense, but nobody had documented it at this scale before and connected it with its role in mosquito production, both as a source for the other neighborhoods and other parcels, and as an opportunity for persistence from year to year. And so to just kind of summarize all of our data on this juvenile habitat, we've got our lower income, higher abandonment sites, and you get mainly discarded, which are I'm showing as red containers here. So these unmanaged discarded habitats. And on this first figure on the top, rain is the x-axis. And so when you have more rain, you get more larvae, more eggs hatch, and you get more juvenile larvae. And what we saw was that if you had more larvae, we tended to then see more pupae in the same block. So if you had a block that had a lot of containers and had more larvae, you saw more pupae. Those are the mosquitoes that are ready to become adults. And when you saw the pupae, you tended to see more adults. So in blocks where you had a lot of pupae, you got a lot of adults. And these are on our lower income, more abandonment areas. This is kind of what you would expect in nature if it rains. And I should say that vegetation also had a similar pattern as rain. If there was more vegetation, you saw more larvae. The larvae need the vegetation for food. That's what falls into their habitats and feeds them. And they also need it because it creates a certain level of humidity and shade. And so there's a lot of environmental control right at the base of the larval. But when you go into the higher income, highly residential, occupied, managed yards, you find mainly these functional, these blue containers. These are things like your bird baths, your rain gutters. And the thing about them is that when it's wet, people tend to remember to go out and tip stuff. And when it's really dry, they tend to go out and add water. And so we actually can't find a strong correlation between the level of environmental regulation, right? So how much has it rained, how much vegetation is there, and larvae. So it breaks down right at this base level. When there are larvae, you tend to find more pupae, and when there are pupae, you tend to find more adults, although again, the slopes are lower, meaning that humans are interacting at every stage of this in these higher income areas. People are out in their yard, they're touching things, they're adding things, they're taking things away, and it does slow mosquito production down. Whereas in the lower income areas where you have more abandonment, the environment's pretty much controlling when you have mosquitoes and how many. And we do see this translate into adults. These are data, and I've summarized with means across all the different years and by month across the x-axis, how many adult female albopictus, that's the tiger mosquito, do you see in a given trap? And you can see that the black line for our lower socioeconomic areas is higher across most of the year than the red line. And so overall, we see about 3 times more mosquitoes in our lower socioeconomic blocks than we do in our high socioeconomic blocks. And these data, again, are across all of our 2013 through 2016 trapping. This arrow that I have over here was the Maryland's threshold limit that was put in place during the task force for Zika response in 2016, that if you found 30 to 35 female 80s, that was a threshold above which the state or county would go in and treat for mosquitoes. So that was a threshold they deemed as a dangerous kind of potential risk above that. And so you can see that even our high income areas hit that at the end of July, but the low income areas are pretty much above that the entire year, or the entire season. Where we do see more, this is discarded containers that had larvae. So where we saw more discarded containers with larvae, we also saw more adults. This is at the block scale. So blocks that had more juvenile habitat are where we sampled more adults. This is albopictus. That was a significant. It's done by a master's student that I worked with, Danielle Bodner. And so these are those kinds of discarded habitats. If you find more of these on a block, we also would then sample adults, and we found more adults on that block. So positive relationship. And so we know that abandoned infrastructure supports more juvenile habitat and greater adult mosquito production. But this did lead to things that I'm working on now to try to get papers out on, to ask whether or not that's a predictive thing. So I just showed you a regression that suggested that they're correlated, right? You get more juvenile habitat, you know that there are going to be more positive adults. It doesn't necessarily mean it's predictive of how many more. And so we have a couple ways we're looking at that. And at what point in the season would you make those predictions? And the other thing that I haven't touched on yet is risk. And so I'm going to touch on both of these just really briefly to finish up. Risk to humans, like when you have more mosquitoes, does that mean more risk? It sure is a good first indicator, but it's not necessarily all we need to know. So testing prediction, we did an experimental intervention on these same blocks in 2017. And again, we know that if you have more discarded containers per block, you expect to find more mosquitoes, and that's a positive regression coefficient. We went out and we found 2 blocks, 2 of the blocks that we'd already worked on in 2 different neighborhoods. And in each neighborhood, we had 1 block that we deemed a control, and then 1 adjacent to it that we deemed a treatment. So we have 2 controls, 2 treatments in 2 different neighborhoods. These are what some of the blocks looked like when we got there. And basically, we went in and we had these big dumpsters for each block and a good-sized team, and we removed garbage. And we filled a dumpster for each block. And I will say that as we had these dumpsters and we're filling them with garbage, people would come by with their pickup trucks full of garbage and ask us if they could dump into the dumpster. So we know that there's this roving need for garbage removal. And the city health department and public works were both really helpful in setting us up with the dumpsters and getting them removed. And we removed a lot of garbage. Probably the grossest thing I've ever done. And so these are the data on those control sites. And so the control sites, we had the week before intervention, we went out and we sampled adult mosquitoes. And then we had our intervention week, and we didn't sample that week. And then we went back a week after the intervention and 2 weeks after the intervention. And so that's what you see here. And the blue line here is the mean for the control across all those weeks. But so obviously, if our intervention, if our garbage removal had an effect, we want to be able to compare it to what would have happened during that same time frame in a place where we didn't do an intervention. So these control data kind of suggest that the mosquito populations were kind of staying even during that period of time, maybe even going down a little. This obviously we can't control for weather, so that's why we want this temporal scope. And so we would have expected the sites where we did the intervention to either go down more or to look a lot like this and not go down much at all. We were hoping that they would go down more. That is, that we would remove all this habitat, and then within 2 weeks, we'd see that the adult population was actually lower because there wasn't as much juvenile habitat. And unfortunately, that's not what we saw, right? So we start out here, and our treatment sites are about the same as our control sites at the beginning, maybe even a little less. 2 of them shoot up. 3 of them shoot up, actually, and 1 of them kind of stays the same. So the intervention was not successful, wildly. We removed tons of garbage, literally, and we know that it was mosquito habitat, and we didn't see an effect on the adults. So this was actually really kind of demoralizing, but really interesting, right? Ecologically, what's going on here? We thought we kind of knew the mechanism, and we had a regression approach that suggested it was a mechanism, and then it turns out it's not predictive, right? We can't remove juvenile habitat and actually decrease the adult population as much as we had hoped to. So what's happening? One option is we didn't do anything, and these populations would have gone up anyway for some reason we didn't measure. The other thing is we may have made things worse. And so one hypothesis about how we may have made things worse is something that we are following up on. And that's looking at this idea that you've got source populations and sink population, source habitat and sink habitat, right? And so the idea with sink habitat is that sometimes there's habitat out there that an animal think looks like a good place to breed. And so they lay their eggs or they have their babies there, but then it turns out not to be a great place to breed at all. And so nothing survives, nothing fledges if it's birds, nothing hatches here for mosquitoes, right? So maybe they're laying their eggs in these fence posts and these cups, and they're laying a lot of eggs there, but they're not actually hatching from these things. So, we see a lot of larvae there, but maybe those larvae don't ever get out as adults. Maybe they just don't stay wet long enough, or there's not enough food. And so maybe it's a sink habitat. And when we went out and we removed all this sink habitat, we removed everything we could pick up. And when it was something like this that we couldn't remove, this fence post, we would cover it so they couldn't use it anymore and nothing could get out. But we couldn't remove the abandoned buildings. And so again, this is a Google Earth image showing one of the rows of our site, and you can see these buildings here just don't have any roofs. Those are wet inside, they're humid inside. We couldn't do anything about removing those. And so maybe we removed a bunch of sink habitat where mosquitoes would have laid their eggs, and instead they started laying their eggs more in the abandoned buildings. That's one hypothesis. Again, something that we need to continue to look into. And this is, of course, really important because the public health message around things like how do you prevent Zika or chikungunya or dengue is that you have to tip it, right? Tip it and toss it. That there's some personal residential responsibility to maintain to get rid of mosquito habitat, and that will be effective in helping to protect residents. Unfortunately, whether or not that's effective might be based on what kind of neighborhood you're in. It's possible that lower socioeconomic neighborhoods just don't have the capacity to remove the real source habitat. And in fact, if you remove a lot of the other habitat, the stuff that's easy to remove, then you actually might be refocusing mosquito populations to use that source habitat. And you could actually see these increases in mosquito populations. So again, this is a hypothesis still and something we're continuing to work on, but it has real implications for how the current public health messaging and really our best tool right now for thinking about how to manage these urban 80s populations, how effective it might be and at what landscape scale. And then what are some of the perverse impacts if you do have increase in mosquito population in certain areas when you remove sink habitat. Those are things we're still looking into. So we know that more unmanaged habitat means more juvenile mosquito habitat and more mosquitoes, about 3 times more mosquitoes we saw on average in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. But how does this? So finally, I just want to touch on these, and I'm not going to really go into them too much, but mosquitoes are annoying, but if they're not biting humans and they're not biting humans regularly, then they're pretty much just annoying. And they do bite lots of different things. Humans are just part of their meals, and different mosquito species focus in on different things. And as I mentioned, you have some species that only feed on things like frogs and snakes. And you can imagine if they're cueing in on certain respiration cues and pheromones and even body temperature, then different animals all give off different cues. And so mosquitoes really do focus in on different animals, and some focus in on birds and some mammals, and some really do focus in on us. I'm sure you've all talked a little bit about Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. That's the one species that's really gotten very good at focusing in on humans. And Aedes albopictus is probably evolving to be more human focused. So when we look at who humans are biting, Aedes albopictus are biting in these urban areas, we look at the proportion of blood meals, and we look at the DNA in their gut. So they've got blood in their gut, and we look at what kind of blood that is based on its DNA. And then we looked at the proportion of the blood meals that came from humans. And in our low socioeconomic areas, those neighborhoods that had 3 times as many mosquitoes, we actually see the lowest proportion of the blood meals coming from human. The highest were in those higher socioeconomic areas. There are more humans per density, right? Because of the abandonment in the low socioeconomic areas, you don't have as many humans, on a block. So it kind of makes sense that they're less likely to come in contact with humans. You also get in the higher socioeconomic neighborhoods people wanting to be out in their backyard more, and so they're out kind of in the green areas that are often avoided in the lower socioeconomic neighborhood. So there's a lot packed into this figure, but the reality, the kind of take home here is that where you see the most mosquitoes isn't necessarily where you're getting the most human biting. Across the year, and here I just want to point out, what are they biting if they're not biting humans? They're biting rats. The gray here is rats. And so this is dominated by mosquito blood meals from lower socioeconomic areas. They are biting humans, but they're biting rats. And finally, when you look at the proportion of abandoned, these are wing sizes of our adult mosquitoes that we collect across the different neighborhoods, where the neighborhoods are represented as how much abandonment is on that neighborhood, how many houses are standing there with nobody in them. And the mosquitoes are actually a little bit bigger when we collect them on the lower income areas. Again, the bigger adult mosquitoes are associated with greater biting efficiency, longer longevity, and actually greater yard where it's green and the mosquitoes are hanging out, then they are going to be exposed. And so behavior plays a huge role in that exposure piece. And so we can show you who gets bit, and we can show you how many mosquitoes are around that neighborhood. But if people aren't showing up in the places where they are likely to get bit, mosquitoes aren't flying over the house, right? They're not flying into these roads and hanging out in the roads. And so there's that mismatch in data and actual risk that really requires a lot of interaction with humans to figure out. This work has all been made possible by a whole lot of people that I have to thank and I'm very grateful for, including a lot of the residents and students who have helped out with the work. And with that, I am done.
Shannon, this has been such a fantastic webinar. I think probably one of the best webinars I have seen in a long time. And one of the reasons that, I chose this article for these incredible C students, interns to read is that I think that the transdisciplinary nature of this research is really so exciting, but also in reading the article, you can see the incredible complexity that we have when we're trying to deal with anything that has to do with mosquitoes and vector-borne disease, everything from behavior to, the issues of epidemiology to habitat to, environmental, the environmental adaptations of the particular critters. And, the articles that came out of this were just incredibly rich. So I want to thank you and thank your team One thing I wanted to ask you though is what part of this interested you the most? Because you were involved in this team, you had a piece of it that you were working on. I was just curious where this is leading your thinking.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. And so kind of talking to people and seeing how people live in some of these neighborhoods was just fascinating. But and there were lots of kind of social justice issues that came out of this that had a lot to do with just garbage and infrastructure management and investment, but not so much to do with my own research. For me, kind of ecologically, the idea that so this idea that you have similar NDVI in these low income and high income neighborhoods, but that greenness isn't one thing, and that the quality of the greenness, both the human perception of the quality of it, and then to some degree the availability of resources from different kinds of plants that would fall into juvenile habitats, and how that associated with different types of vegetation that were more often seen in the kind of lower socioeconomic or opportunistic / abandoned areas. Some of the times things that were growing there, we had several students do different projects looking at, if you take a collection of vegetation debris from an abandoned lot versus somebody's yard, and then you try to rear mosquitoes in it, what happens? There are certain plants that have very strong impacts on how fast the mosquitoes grow and how many pupate. We're still trying to do the work to see if you can actually get reliable bigger mosquitoes just from the vegetation. I think it's probably a vegetation / temperature effect. But the opportunity to really look at kind of some of these differences just that are not something I would have initially gone in thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
People don't tend to think about the actual species of vegetation and how that influences mosquitoes. So that's one of the things we're kind of looking at now. And then getting at whether or not vector competence actually does differ. It's a little bit of a difficult task to fund, just because there aren't a huge, there's not. I'm really glad that Zika didn't take off and kind of make a huge appearance in the U.S. But I feel like every time the communities gear up to be ready for Zika or to be ready for chikungunya, and then nothing happens, it makes it harder to get folks to gear up again.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we're always kind of in this push-pull of, we're really scared right now, so we can't fund any research on it because we just have to do mosquito control, or why would we fund research on that because Baltimore's never going to have an outbreak. It's that kind of tenuous area between panic and response and research that's really.
It really is. And, the work that I was doing with USAID, we were funded because in 2015, we had the Zika outbreak.
Yeah.
So immediately there was funds available for us to develop this app that we're using. And very excited, lots and lots of opportunities. Now, we're struggling to find additional funds for the same reason. It's kind of the funding landscape is kind of a boom or bust landscape. And that works against, effective vector management. So I totally hear you there. I wanted to make one other comment before we go, because I know we're almost done here, but when I was working in Peru, I was in Iquitos, and I was working with Amy Morrison. I don't know if you know much about her research, but she was talking about in Iquitos, she's seen exactly the same thing, that when they're doing a lot of tipping and tossing, what they're finding is that these Aegypti mosquitoes there find themselves, what she calls them the cryptic habitats. I don't know if you use that terminology.
Yep.
But where they're no longer finding the mosquitoes in the open barrels outside the house where they're collecting water, but they're found in drips under the refrigerator, and in covered areas where there was once a drain spout and there is no longer a drain spout. So it's as they have gotten more efficient in cleaning up their areas, it has become more and more difficult to control. So your work really shows, the incredible complexity of the issue that we're trying to address. And that's one reason I think that that paper was incredibly great as a sort of introduction to mosquito research, because it tries to do everything, it does it well, but also shows how there's so many variables, and you really can't work with it unless you look at all of those, right? So
yeah. I mean, it's hard to move beyond a Band-Aid.
Right. One other thing is, I don't know if it was your REU student, but we have a lot of students that are going to be on this webinar who are, rising seniors, and they're going to be going to college next year. Could you mention just briefly about the REU program, what that was about, if you have familiarity with that? Because I think that's going to be something that they're going to be, this group of students are very highly competitive to get to become REU students.
Yeah, it's an incredible program. I mean, the NSF, National Science Foundation REU program is, we've had a program here at Cary, so they fund a site REU program that has been going on for 30 years. Mm-hmm. Every summer we have 10 to 12 students come and they do independent research. They each have a mentor. So I mentored 2 students this year, and they both kind of came up with their own projects. But because it's a site program, there are also some site level infrastructure. So they're not just coming here and being left alone all summer. They're part of a group, and they also learn, we focus on translation. So they work on skills building for translating science, for talking about science to different groups, and for writing science, both for the public and for other scientists. Other places have similar site programs for REUs, and these all tend to be really competitive. Again, we get 200 to 300 applicants for 10 to 12 spots. It's an incredible experience. It's paid, which is necessary, but not all that common for internship type experiences. There are also REUs associated with individual grants. And so if you have an NSF grant, you can apply to get an REU stipend, which is to hire an undergrad just to help you with your grant, which is different than the one we have at Cary, but I've also worked with students in Baltimore to do that. So it's a great opportunity, I think, for every student who's interested in research and science. Even if you don't think you're going to go on and get a graduate degree in science, doing some sort of hands-on research experience is just invaluable. And so they should all feel free to reach out to me if they want to learn more about the Cary REU. I know we tend to try to focus on rising juniors and seniors in college. Mm-hmm. And then we have a rising sophomore, but for the most part, they're in their 2nd to 3rd year.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank you for this really amazing webinar that touched on so many different aspects of mosquito science that I couldn't keep notes fast enough. Also, I want to thank you for talking a little bit about your science trajectory, and also talking about future opportunities that these amazing SEAS interns can be looking forward to in the future. So Dr. LaDeau, I want to thank you again, and I hope that we'll stay in touch. I'm very excited about what you're doing, and I know that we'll be able to hopefully meet in the future, maybe sometime this year in New York. So thank you again. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you. It was nice to be here and meet you all.
Mosquito infestation rates, mosquito population growth, and human risk of exposure. Aedes albopictus, or the tiger mosquito, is an invasive that arrived in the U.S. in the late 1980s that has pretty quickly taken over mosquito communities in the Northeast. Our research really shown that people in some neighborhoods are at greater risk just because mosquito populations are much larger in those neighborhoods. Specifically, we found that lower income neighborhoods tend to have a lot more mosquito breeding habitat. And so this is any water holding containers that persist for at least a week. And in lower income neighborhoods in the city, you have less frequent trash collection, and you also have a lot of abandoned and vacant lots where trash can collect. And these types of containers, even if they're as small as a plastic cup, can be really productive mosquito habitat. And so when we look at the adult mosquito population in the neighborhoods that have this kind of habitat, we find that they can be up to 3 times greater. What gets me excited about this research is that every component of it has really direct interactions with the residents whose yards we're using, because we're really able to use our ecological understanding of what makes mosquito populations grow in a specific area to test some interventions. I feel like the science I'm doing really is both addressing things that people already see as a problem and helping to give options for management of that problem. And that's not something I've had the opportunity to be as directly involved in my prior research. And it is something I've gotten more and more excited about in the current work, which really has a fundamental socio-economic and sociological component.